discussing two of the more common types of flooded cell or flooded lead acid batteries, known as SLI and deep cycle batteries. And we're going to talk about some of the common ratings you might find on them, such as CA, CCA, RC, AH, and the group number. So yesterday when we left off, in our last lesson, we were talking about what makes up a cell, and inside a battery you're going to find a number of cells. In a 12-volt battery, as you know, there's going to be 6 cells, each one making about 2.1 volts. The 2.1 volts is based on the chemistry inside that cell, so we're using a sulfuric acid and water combination for an electrolyte, and we're using lead plates. So these lead acid cells are going to make 2.1 volts for us. When we put those cells in series, the volts will add up, and we will get a higher voltage. And what we need to talk about a little bit today is the plates themselves inside the cells and how they're arranged. So, a single positive plate and a single negative plate would in fact make a cell, and it would still make 2.1 volts, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of current or amps. So what we need to make amps or current is surface area So the more surface area of the plates we can get, the more current or amps that cell is going to be able to produce. And as we know from series circuit laws, the voltages of the cells will add up, but the amps are going to be the same because it's a series circuit. There's only one path. So all the cells will be working together to make amps, but the plates within the cells are kind of the determining factor on that. And the weakest cell is going to be the limiting factor of your battery. So, I digress. On the positive grouping of plates inside the battery, there's going to be a metal strap, and there'll be several plates attached to that strap. And sort of interwoven with those plates will be your negative plates. Will also all be connected by a strap. So within each cell you're going to find two groupings of plates. You're going to find a positive group and a negative group. There'll be some little separators in between so they don't short circuit to each other. If it's an AGM battery rather than a flooded cell, there'll be little absorbed glass mats acting like sponges in between rather than just separators, and those sponges or those mats will be holding the electrolyte for us. And this is what's going to make up one cell. That cell is going to be completely sealed off from its neighboring cell in the battery, where this little array of plates is going to start again. The only difference is the negative connection of one cell is going to be connected to the positive connection of the next cell. And so on. On to the next cell. Obviously the cells are all going to be equal sizes. I just kind of ran out of room on my board here. But this is basically the same thing we have going on in home devices and flashlights and things of that nature. The positive of one cell is connected to the negative of the next. And so the voltages will all add up. So if you had 3 1.5 volt battery cells, like a AA or a AAA or a C or a D, your total would be 4.5 volts. In the same way we get our 12.6 volts out of a 6-cell automotive battery. So how those plates are actually arranged and constructed has a lot to do with the amount of amps that you can get out of this cell, and also how long you can draw those amps from this cell. So the type of battery we find under the hood of our car is what's known as an SLI battery, which stands for starting, lights, and ignition. And of those three, its biggest job is the starting. We want a high surge of current, a big high amount of current to run to our starter motor and help us crank over our engine, because we don't want to get out front and hand crank start the car. And so in order to do that, this battery has to be designed to give a really large surge of current. But only for a very limited amount of time. You really only crank the engine over for a few seconds each time. If you cranked an engine for a solid 5 seconds, you would actually think something was wrong with the car, like there'd be a starting problem. You very rarely crank the car that long. So high current surge for a very short duration. Basically, as soon as the car starts, the alternator is going to start producing electricity, and we're going to replenish what we took from that battery. We're going to recharge that battery. So the amps and the current are basically determined by the plates, or the surface area. An SLI battery is going to have lots of thin plates. By making the plates as thin as possible, not so thin that they become not durable, not so thin that they would become vulnerable to breakage in the battery, but thin enough that we can fit as many of them as possible in the cell, is going to give us the greatest amount of surface area. Because the plates themselves are basically all connected in parallel on that strap, so that they act like one big plate. So lots of thin plates, lots of surface area, gives you amps, gives you high current ability. And one thing I should mention about the amps before we go too far as well, I guess I can erase starting lights ignition here. Let's say this SLI battery here has an 800 cranking amp rating, and we're going to come back to that rating later. That battery can deliver you 800 amps. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to deliver you 800 amps. So if you open the glove box and that little tiny glove box light comes on, there's not 800 amps surging through that light bulb. There's probably about 0.2 of an amp going through that light bulb. So just remember Ohm's law, E equals I times R, is going to determine, or it's what's going to have the effect on how many amps actually flow in the circuit. So the battery is going to have an amp rating, but your circuit is still going to demand what it wants. So at 12 volts, and say 12 ohms, you'd only get 1 amp, not 800. Okay, your starter motor is a different story. Your starter motor is almost a dead short, so your starter motor is going to draw an awful lot of current. And again, not for a very long period of time, but the battery has to be able to deliver us that current to make sure that the car starts reliably every time. So just wanted to clear that up. When we say amps, we're talking how many amps the battery can deliver, not necessarily how many it's going to deliver. Okay, back on track. So that's our SLI battery. Starting lights ignition. Provide power to our ignition system, we provide power to our starter, we have the ability to run the lights even with the engine not on, and that's basically what it's for. And we want to get high current for a very short period of time. So what these SLI batteries don't want to do is they don't want to be deeply discharged, like they don't appreciate it when you leave the lights on and you walk into the building and you forget about it and you come out at 2:30 and the lights have been on for 6 hours and now they're very, very dim and the car won't start. Battery doesn't appreciate that. It's going to have to be charged back up from some sort of external battery charger, some sort of power source, or you're going to have to get a jump start and let the alternator kind of take it from there. And when we get into the alternator section, when we talk about charging systems, we'll find out why that's not such a great idea. But that's basically its purpose. Just give us high current just for a short period of time. On the other hand, we have what's known as a deep cycle battery. Deep cycle batteries aren't typically automotive batteries. They're more for things like RV RVs or recreational vehicles. They're what they call a marine battery. And basically, this is a battery. We'll come back to that. This is a battery that's going to give you much less current, a relatively low current draw, but for a much longer duration. That's not to say a deep cycle battery wouldn't start an engine. A lot of them will. Again, in boats, a lot of your marine engines are electric start. You can get a high current surge out of a deep cycle battery that will start the engine. However, it's not going to really appreciate being hooked up to, let's say, your giant Dodge diesel pickup truck, and it takes tons of current to start it in the winter because it's cold. That's not really what it's for. It's meant for providing a lower amount of current, but for a longer period of time. So like when you're out on the water and you need to run lights at night, but there's no engine running, or if you have a little trolling motor, you're going to go fishing, so there's no power source here, it's just this little motor powered by a battery in the boat, and you're going to sit there and fish for hours. A deep cycle battery is the type of battery you want in that little boat to run that trolling motor. It doesn't take a whole lot of current, but you need to be able to draw that current for a long length of time. And this battery also has to be tolerant of being discharged more deeply, hence the name a deep cycle. So, whereas a regular SLI battery maybe only discharges about 10% while you start the car, a deep cycle battery might discharge 80% as you drive around the lake all day long. So, kind of a different application. You'll once in a while see that somebody's put a deep cycle battery in a car to use as a starting battery, and while it'll do the job, it's really not meant for that purpose. It's not ideally suited to it. So it's probably not going to last as long as a proper SLI battery because it's not meant to be delivering those high current surges all the time. So SLIs and deeps, as long as we have that straight, we're going to start talking about a couple of the ratings here. An SLI battery is going to have a much higher cranking amp rating, or CA. The amps used to crank the starter over. A deep cycle battery is going to have a much longer RC, or reserve capacity. Yes, I know I make my V's kind of look like U's. Alright, so many car batteries will come with a reserve capacity specification so that you can compare one to another. Most of them will come with a cranking amp specification, and the same goes for deep cycle batteries, but you're going to see that your RC is much higher on a deep, and your CA is much higher on an SLI. Your CA and also your CCA, your cold cranking amps. Okay, a little tiny whiteboard starting to get a little crowded here, so time to erase. Okay, when it comes to car batteries, one of the first specs we usually see when we look at the label on top is the cold cranking amp rating. So, cold cranking amps is a measurement of how many amps you can draw out of that battery for 30 seconds without drawing your voltage down to too low of a voltage. I believe it's 10.5 volts or 10.2 volts. Whatever it is, the higher the number on the cold cranking amp battery, the better. So the car is going to come with some sort of specification. A little car might have, say, a 450 CCA battery, maybe something like a compact car, or a Corolla, or a Civic, or something like that. Whereas a bigger truck might have something like an 850 CCA battery. You can always put a bigger CCA rating battery into a car because, again, the battery is not determining how many amps flow in your circuits. The battery is just being given a specification of how many amps it can deliver. So it's always okay to put a bigger CCA battery in a car. It's not a good idea to put too small of a CCA battery because on a cold winter morning when the vehicle doesn't want to turn over quite so easily, you might have a hard time starting the car. So it's always a good idea to have a higher rating. Also, the actual amps that the battery can deliver are going to diminish over time. As the battery gets 5, 6 years old, you're not going to still be able to get that 850 amps out of that battery. So, just a couple of things to note. Cold cranking amps is measured at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas cranking amps is measured at 32 degrees. So they're basically the exact same rating, just at different temperatures. Around here we tend to see cold cranking amps more often. A lot of batteries have both specifications on their label. The CA is always going to be a higher number because it's at a warmer temperature when the battery is more active. As you might know from science class, cold, or a lack of heat rather, slows down chemical reactions, and that's what's taking place in our battery, is a chemical reaction. So just know that more is always better as long as you can fit the battery in the car. Okay, an 850 cca battery is probably not going to fit properly in the tray on a little Honda Civic. Their batteries are very small compared to the battery you're going to find under the hood of a big Ford truck or a Chevy truck or something like that. So it's always safer to put more when it comes to cranking amps. When it comes to this reserve capacity down here, it's sort of a similar thing. You can always have more. The car is probably not going to have a specification. It's probably not going to tell you how many minutes it wants. So a reserve capacity is a time. It's number of minutes. So if you look at the top of the battery and it says RC90, that means that battery has a 90-minute reserve capacity rating. So for 90 minutes, that battery is rated to deliver current with no help from the charging system, no help from an alternator, without its voltage falling too low. And again, I believe it's 10 point something or other volts, 10.75 I believe. It's really not that important for the purpose of this lesson, but just know that that's a time spec. Why you would care about that? Well, imagine your alternator failed, so the little battery light comes on the dashboard, or on your message center it says service charging system. It kind of gives you an idea, how long can I continue to operate this vehicle, maybe to get yourself someplace safe, or get home, or get to a shop. So at a 90-minute RC, after 90 minutes the car's probably not going to run anymore. There probably won't be enough volts left in that battery to keep you running. But 60 minutes, maybe. 45 minutes, maybe. Again, how many electrical loads are you running? If you still have the radio on and the wipers going and the lights on, you're not going to have as much time as if you just leave the engine running and turn off all the accessories. But it is kind of a good thing to know. If you're shopping for a battery and you're comparing one brand to another, if one has a higher RC for the same cranking amps, go for the one with the higher RC. It's going to be a better battery. It's going to be a higher quality battery. So you can always go higher on the reserve capacity. And again, the car is probably not going to have a spec. If you look in the owner's manual or the service info, there's probably not a specification. There very likely will be a spec on what it wants for a minimum CCA, but probably not an RC. Another rating you might have heard of is what they call the amp hour rating, or AH. It's a very similar specification to RC. You used to see it more commonly on European cars or other imports. American cars never really typically specified the amp hours that they required of their battery, but it's very, very similar to how they rate RC, only they're taking a certain amount of amps out of the battery for 20 hours without the voltage falling too low, and then whatever that amp number is, they multiply it by the 20 hours. So it's kind of a funny thing. So if you have a 100 amp hour battery, that means they took 5 amps out of that battery over the course of 20 hours without the voltage falling too low. So a higher number would allow them to take more amps and achieve the same result. So again, a higher number is always better. The place you're more likely to see this is with power tools. When you go to the Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever, and you're looking at the tool aisle and you're looking at the rechargeable cordless tools, there'll be an amp hour rating on those batteries. A bigger amp hour rating at the same voltage is going to give you longer tool life, longer tool performance. You're going to be able to use that tool for longer periods of time without the battery overheating or the tool overheating or the battery dying. So, for instance, I have a 2 amp hour battery for my cordless drill, and it does just fine with the drill, but if I put it in my cordless Sawzall, it doesn't last very long. I have a 3 amp hour battery that works better in the Sawzall, but it's heavier. It's a bigger battery, so I don't tend to use it in my drill, if that makes any sense. So you will sometimes see an amp hour rating on a battery. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Again, typically your European cars. Okay, and then the last spec that we should really talk about today in this video, and you will see this for sure, is known as the group number. So there's an organization known as BCI. It's the Battery Council International, and they determine some specs for batteries, and one of those specs is what they call the group number. And the group number has to do with the physical attributes of the battery, the length, the width, the height, and the terminal configuration. And the numbers are kind of these odd, arbitrary numbers. You'll see group 24s, you'll see group 78s, group 36s, group 58s. And it's kind of like these little batteries we use in the home. There's C's and D's and AA's, and actually, as we learned, these aren't batteries, they're cells. So the number was decided by someone other than us. It doesn't really mean much to us, but it's more the physical attributes of that battery. So let's just say this is a group 24. That's going to have to do with how wide it is, how tall it is, how wide it is in this direction, and also which terminal is positive and which terminal is negative, and also what style terminals. When you get into something like a group 75, that's a GM battery, or a common battery that you used to find in GMs. Their terminals are not on the top. They have the side post terminals that bolt on. So you might have seen these as well. Some people don't like them. They're a little harder to work with. They corrode a lot less than the top terminals, though, if you've ever noticed. The top terminals often get green corrosion up there, blue and green corrosion, and the side terminals don't typically. So, at any rate, your group number is set by BCI, and the car manufacturer is going to have a specification. So like for instance, your Ford Taurus here, this battery I have on the bench just out of sight of the camera is a group 36 that came out of my Ford Taurus. Your Ford truck might take a 24, etc. So size and terminal configuration. Okay, so there's sometimes more than one group number battery that could fit a particular car. Sometimes the higher option vehicle gets a bigger battery, and the tray that the battery sits in under the hood can accommodate a smaller battery. If you have the option of a smaller battery or a bigger battery, always buy the bigger one. It's going to give you better service, and it's nice to know that you have that little more reserve there. So you got to make sure that you're putting in a battery that fits properly in the tray, though. If you can't get the battery to properly hold down in the tray, or if the battery is too tall, it could actually accidentally contact the hood when you slam the hood. Those are considerations you have to take. And there's one other thing. Certain group numbers come with multiple terminal configurations. For instance, there's a group number, I think it's 78, but don't quote me on that. That comes with dual terminals. It's got side terminals and top posts. So that's more of a universal application. That battery can be used in, like, say, a Ford that takes a battery that size but needs the top posts, or a GM that takes a battery that size that needs the side posts. If there's a dual post battery available in your group size, that's kind of handy if you're the type to put electrical accessories in, because then you can use whichever style post the car requires to hook up to the regular electrical system. And then you've got the other posts there that you can hook up to your extra things, so your amplifier in the trunk, or your plow, or a winch, or something to that effect. So, kind of handy. And the last thing I want to say about group numbers, if it's followed by an R, for example, let's say this is a group 26. There's your positive, there's your negative. If I go to the store and I'm looking for a group 26 for my car, and they don't have one, but they have a group 26R, the physical attributes are going to be the same, the amps it puts out are going to be the same, the terminals are going to be reversed. So anytime you see a battery with a -R after it, You have to be cautious of that because that's going to be a reverse terminal. So if your car takes a 26R and you buy a 26, the terminals are opposite. If you don't pay attention and you go to hook the cables up without noticing the plus and the minus engraved in the case on the battery, you're going to possibly accidentally hook your battery up backwards and you're going to do some electrical damage to your car. So be careful of the R batteries. Sometimes you can get away with it. Sometimes the cables are long enough that you could cross them, or there's enough slack you could spin the battery around in the case and put it down the other way. But really the right thing is to put the correct battery in there. So be cautious of R. R means a reverse terminal. Okay, so I think we covered just about everything. We have an SLI battery to start a car, a deep cycle battery to run electrical loads without an alternator, so like a trolling motor or lights in an RV. The amps that come out of these batteries are going to be a little bit different. The deep cycle is going to give you less amps for a longer period of time, and that's determined by the number of plates in there and the thickness of the plates. The cold cranking amp and the cranking amps with a battery, you always want to at least meet the spec that the car comes with. You can always go bigger, don't go smaller. The same with an RC or a reserve capacity. If you can buy two different models of batteries and one's got a higher RC, always go for the higher one. And for the group number, you should always be looking to put the appropriate group size battery back in the car so that it fits the hold down properly, it fits the tray properly, and watch out for that R. We don't want to see anybody hooking their cables up backwards and frying their electrical system. Alright, so I think that's all I wanted to discuss today. I hope when I get to the other side of this camera it hasn't timed out on me and make me have to